Hello, and welcome everybody to the Kabbalat Shabbat for this particular week. And you're joining me here this week, Rabbi Meir Shindler here at Richmond, and not in the synagogue. We're going to have a service in the synagogue slightly later. But if you are following in the green Siddur, we're starting on page 256. Yedid nefesh Ovarachamon Meshach Avdecha El Retzonecha Yaretz Avdecha Kamayal Yishtachaveh El Moladarecha Yerabla Yedidasecha Minofesef Vechal Tam Adonai Zevalam Nafshi chalas abasecha Ana el narefana la beharos la noam zibecha os tis chazek v'sitrape V'hayisala simcha salam V'asik yemuna rachamecha V'chusana al beinahu becha Ki ze kama nitzavti Liros besiferes uzecha Eilecha medalibi Mechusana V'yalti salam Higalena Ufros chavivi alai Etzukas sheloi mecha Ta'ir eretz michvodecha Nagila v'nismecha bach Ma'ereot kiva moed V'chaneiner ki me'alam Yalalai 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 If you just joined us, we're on page 258 in the green Siddur. Lechun ranena l'Adonai naria letzrishenu nekama pana b'soda b'zmias naria lo ki ezodom. Arbaim shana kut bedar, Voimalam tuile bavheim, Veim liatu derachoi, Asher nishbati be'api, Im yebaun amenu chasi, Shiru l'Adonai shir chodosh, Shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz, Shiru l'Adonai Baruch Shema, Basru miyom liyom Yeshua so, Tapru v'goyim kevoda, V'chol ha'amim nifli yosav, Ki gadol Adonai, Umulal meyod, Noirau, Al kol Elohim, ay, ki kol Elohim, Wamim melilim, V'Adonai shamayim oso, Oid ve'hodar lefanav, Oid ve'tiferes b'mikdasho, Havu l'Adonai mishpechoi samim, Havu l'Adonai kavod ba'od, Havu l'Adonai kevod shemo, sayu mincha, uba'u lechatzroso, ay, shtachu l'Adonai behadras kodesh, kelu mipanav kol haaretz, simru v'goyim Adonai malach, hafti koin tevel, Baltimore, Yodin Amim B'Meisharim, Yismechu Hashamayim V'Sogel Oretz, Yiramayam, Lo'o, Yaloi Sodai, Ay Bechol Asher Bo, ay, Avir Adenu Kol Atzeyor, Lifnei Adonai, Kiva lishpot haaretz, yishpot tevel b'tzedek, ve'yamim be'emunah, yalai, yalalai, Adonai malach togedoret yisnuchim rabim. Anon barachel sivase. Rabbi Adonai sinura, shoimer nafshos chasidav, miyad reshoim yatzileim, herzaru latzadik, ulishrilei simcha tzadikim Adonai, v'hoidu lezecher kadsho, mizmor shiru l'Adonai, Shir Chadash, Ki Nifloi Sasa, Shiala Yemino, Uzara Akacha, Tia Adonai Yeshua So, Veinei Agayim Gilatit Kaso, Hay Zachar Chasto V'yemunasa, Leveis Yisrael, Ra'u Chala Seyaret, Eis Yeshua Eloheinu, Hariu l'Adonai kol haaretz, Pitzchu v'ranenu v'zameru, Zamru l'Adonai v'kinar, V'chinar l'kol zimra, V'chatzai tzeresh v'kol shofar, Hariu l'fnei HaMelech Adonai, Yiramayam u'melo'o, Tevel v'yoshev eva, Neharo simcha uchav, Yachad orim yeraleinu, Lifnei Adonai kiva, וישמע את הארץ, ישמע תבל בצדק, וימים במישרים. אדוני מלך יגזו עמים, יושב קרובים תנות הארץ. Moshe v'Aaron b'Kohanav, u'Shemuel b'Kodei Shemo, koirim el Adonai, v'hu ya'anem, v'amud anan yidaber aleim, Shomer Dreido Sabachai Knasan Lomo Adonai Eloheinu Ata Nisam El Noisel Yisrael V'Nokei Malali Lasam Rameh Adonai Eloheinu V'hishtachavu l'arkacho ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu mizmor leDavid havu l'Adonai bnei lim havu l'Adonai kavod va'od ay 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 havu l'Adonai kavod shemo yishtachavu l'Adonai hadras kodesh kol Adonai alamayim meila kavod irim Adonai almayim rabim kol Adonai ba'koach ay 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 kol Adonai be'hadar kol Adonai shober arozim vayeshaber Adonai et ardei halevonon vayarkideim kamo egel levanon besiryan kamo v'nriei mayayay kol Adonai Choytei blabazeish kol Adonai Yachil Adonai midbar kadesh kol Adonai yecholel hayalos vayechesov yaros uvehechalo Oikuloi oimer kavod ay 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 Adonai Lamabul Yashav Vayeshev Adonai Melech Li'olam Adonai Oiv Le'amo Yitein Adonai Yivarech Es Amo V'Shalom Ayay nai nai lai la lai Ayay lai la lai 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 la lai Ya lai la lai 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 ay lai 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 la lai lai la 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 lai ay na nai nai ya la 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 lai nai na nai nai ya la 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 lai ya lai na nai 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 na 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 ona bekoach gedulas mincha Lecha dili kraskala Pnei Shabbat nekabela Lecha dili kraskala Pnei Shabbat nekabela Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad Ishmi'anu elam yuchad Adonai echad u'shemo echad L'shem Luciferes v'nitzila Lecha doidi likras kala Penei Shabbos nekabela, lechadedi likras kala. Penei Shabbos nekabela, likras Shabbos lechuven elcha, ki mekor abalacha, meidosh mikedem nesucha, say maseh machshavat techila. Lechadedi, lechadedi likras kala, penei Shabbos nekabela, lechadedi likras kala, penei Shabbos nekabela, migdash melech ir melucha, kumitzi mitaravecha, Rab lach sheves v'mekabocho, lehu yachamol la yichem la. Lechadedi likras kala, penei Shabbos nekabela, lechadedi likras kala, penei Shabbos nekabela. Is na'ari me'afar kumi, Livshi bigdei tivarte chami, al yad ben yishai beis halachmi, karbo el nafshi ge'ala. Lechadedi likrat kala, penei Shabbos nekabela, lechadedi likrat kala, penei Shabbos nekabela. Hisayrari, ki vayre kumiyari, Uri, shirabeiri, kevod Adonai alayich nigla. Lechadedi likras kala, penei Shabbos nekabela, lechadedi likras kala, penei Shabbos nekabela. Lo sevo shiva lo sikol mi, matish tochachi matemi, bach yechesu ani yami, v'nimnesa iratila, lechadedi likras kala, penei Shabbos nekabla, lechadedi likras kala, penei Shabbos nekabla. Hayulim shisa, shoy soyich, verachaku, kol mevalayich, yosis salayich, Elohayich, kimsos kasan, al-kala, lechadedi likras kala, penei Shabbos nekabla, lechadedi likras kala, penei Shabbos nekabla. Yamin usmal, tifroti v'yesadeinai, ta'ariti, al yadish, ben parzi v'nismecha, v'nagila, lechadedi likras kala, penei Shabbos, nekabla, lechadedi likras kala, penei Shabbos nekabela. My son Akiva recites and sings together with us the Yigdal song. I just want to share a few words about this week's portion. Now, I'm guessing that the vast majority of the people on the other side of the screen enjoy music. If you enjoy music, say aye. Okay, nobody else can hear you, but at least you said it. I'm sure it's true. And I can tell you that there was one time that my wife and myself went to a concert. It was in the Royal Festival Hall, and we were listening to this orchestra play. I don't remember exactly what they were playing, and it was beautiful. And suddenly there was one part where one of the instruments of the orchestra seemed to be a little bit louder than the way that we knew this piece to be played. and it didn't feel right. In fact, it grated. You couldn't appreciate the whole piece of music because there was one instrument that seemed to be clanging that little bit louder than it should have done. And anybody who understands, has a bit of appreciation for music, you can understand that music either harmonizes with us, it's beautiful and it feels beautiful, or if it doesn't feel quite right, if it's a little bit off, then it grates. I don't know if you're familiar with the famous conductor Arturo Toscanini. He was a very, very famous conductor. In fact, he died in 1957, but he was one of the people who was very instrumental in starting up the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra. And as he was getting older, and obviously he was too old to conduct, nevertheless he was composing. And one of the orchestras in his old orchestra in America, the NBC Symphonic Orchestra in America, Radio Symphonic in America, were going to be playing one of his new compositions. They were premiering his new composition. And he wanted to sit back and relax to listen to this piece of music. And his biographer, who was sitting there with him, and they were listening to this piece of music being played for the first time over the radio. And it was awesome. It was beautiful. So after the piece of music, his biographer turns around to Toscanini and says, well, how was it? Wasn't that absolutely fabulous? Wasn't it amazing? Now, Toscanini was a little bit of a perfectionist. He said, no. He said, no. That piece was composed for 14 violins, and I could only hear 13 violinists playing. Now, the biographer thought he was mad. He thought, look, I'm not going to argue with this maestro, the maestro of Toscanini. So he goes, and the next morning he calls up the director of the orchestra and says, look, I just wanted to know how many violinists were playing in the orchestra at the time you were playing that piece of music. He says, well, to truth be told, is we had 13 violinists. They were meant to be 14, but one of them became ill very, very suddenly just before the concert. We didn't have time to replace them. And therefore, we played the piece of music with only 13 violinists. Someone who's so sensitive to music like Toscanini, he could pick up on that. That piece of music didn't sit well with him because that piece of music was meant to have 14 violinists playing and it only had 13. In this week's portion, we have the mitzvah of the writing of the Torah. The Torah tells us, God commands we've got to write. God tells Moshe, now you've got to write for yourself this Torah. But that's not what the words say. It says you should write for yourself this song. And most commentaries understand this to mean referring to next week's portion, the Song of Ha'azinu. But actually, those who code the different mitzvot, we learn out from here that there's a mitzvah to write or to aid the writing of facilitate the writing of the Sefer Torah. And how do we understand this? Because how can the word Shira, which means song, mean the Torah? So Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, who wrote a book called the Ketav Kabbalah, says a beautiful answer. He says, because of a piece of music, the way it works is it's all harmonious as long as each note follows on from the next one perfectly. Each one as a sequence of notes goes together and blends together so perfectly, whether they are being played at the same time or even those which are consecutive to one another. So it is with Torah. Torah, each verse is laid out perfectly as it's meant to be. If one note is off, doesn't quite fit, the whole piece of music kind of jars. It doesn't seem to make sense. And therefore, when we take a look and we study the Torah, we know that it's the Torah from God and it's perfect. So when we study it, we have to examine it. And if there's anything that seems a little bit off to us, something we don't completely understand, then we are obligated to therefore go and really try and understand what it is that the Torah is trying to tell us. But it says, you've got to write it for yourself. And that also means that when we study the Torah, we have to make our own acquisition on it. We've got to make it ours. It's all very nice to sit back and listen to a Torah class, but if we don't get the opportunity to really give ourselves a chance, study Hebrew and learn it inside for ourselves in the text, then it doesn't quite have the same sweetness as if we hear it passively. And so as we're approaching Yom Kippur this year, perhaps this should be the message, that we take the opportunity this year and take responsibility for our own character growth, as we do, of course, in Yom Kippur, but also our own Torah learning. And if we proactively take a responsibility for inscribing ourselves in the book of life, then Be'ezrat Hashem, with the help of God, He will inscribe us in the book of life. Gemar Chatima Tova. Okay, we're just going to conclude with Yigdal. Ready?
יגדל אלוהים חי וישתבח נמסוב ייני סמסיסו
אחד ואין יחיד כייחודו נעלם וגם אין סוף ליחדוסו
אין לו תמושגו ואין אגף לא נערך אליו קדושו
כמון לכל דבר אשר נברא ראשון ואין ראשיס לראשיסו
עיני אדוני לעם לכל מעצור ירד לעשו ימלכוסו
שפע נבואתו נשאנו אל אנשי סגולתו וספרתו
Come Israel, come Shad, Navi Mabit, Astminaso.
תרסם נשאן לימו אל על יד נביאו נאמן פסו
Lo yachlif al, velo yamertaso, le'olamim lazulaso.
סופר יודע ששרינו מביט לסוף דבר בקדמוסו
Melish chesed, kemifala, naisen rosh harakarish
ישלח לקץ ימין משיחנו לפתות מחכה קץ ישועתו
Sim Yachayel, Baruch Chassid, Baruch Adei Shem Telasai.
ניסים יחייל ברוך תעשו ברוך הדיין שם תהילסו. Wish you all a Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for joining us this week. I hope you have a wonderful, a blissful Shabbat, and of course a Gemar Chatima Tova as well.